The decade after the First World War was supposed to be the era of peace. The era when borders would stay quiet, when nations would rebuild, and when leaders would swear that nothing like 1914 would ever happen again. But the world from 1931 to 1934 was not healing. It was cracking, quietly, slowly, and then suddenly, until the road to World War II became inevitable long before the first shot was fired. The warning signs didn't begin with armies. They began with hunger, anger, poverty, and fear. The Great Depression hit the world like an earthquake. Factories in the United States shut down by the tens of thousands. Families stood for hours in bread lines. Banks collapsed under their own weight. The economy that once powered the modern world now barely survived day to day. America turned inward, trying to save itself, refusing to look beyond its own borders. Across the Atlantic, Great Britain struggled to hold its empire together. Industries collapsed. Coal mines shut down. Millions lost their jobs. The government cut military spending to the bone. The British people wanted peace above everything, even if peace required looking away from danger. France was no different. Politically divided, financially weak, and psychologically scarred by World War I, France still carried the weight of 1.3 million dead soldiers. The nation was determined never to fight Germany again if it could be avoided. French leaders built the Maginot Line, a massive underground fortress stretching along the German border, because they already feared Germany would rise again, but they were too exhausted to stop it. Meanwhile, in China, floods, famine, civil war, and political chaos tore the country apart. Warlords ruled provinces like kings. The nationalist government was fragile. The Chinese communist movement was rising. The people were desperate. The nation was vulnerable. The Soviet Union marched into the 1930s with massive promises of industrial power and progress. But behind the propaganda, Stalin's forced collectivization starved millions. Entire villages vanished from hunger. Anyone suspected of disloyalty disappeared into prisons or mass graves. The Soviet Union looked strong from a distance, but inside, it was bleeding. In this chaos, three aggressive nations saw an opportunity to shape the world with force. Japan moved first. On September 18, 1931, near the city of Mukden in Manchuria, Japanese officers staged a small explosion on their own railway track. It barely scratched the rails, but they immediately blamed China. Within hours, Japanese troops launched a full invasion. China, weak and disorganized, could barely resist. The League of Nations, the world's peace organization, sent investigators, wrote letters, and held meetings, but nothing more. Japan had studied the world carefully. They understood a simple truth. Democratic nations talked a lot but acted slowly, very slowly. The Japanese army marched through Manchuria with almost no resistance from the outside world. By early 1932, Japan created a puppet state called Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned it. Japan laughed and walked out. No punishment, no boycott, no military action, nothing. Japan's leaders learned the first lesson of the decade. The world would look away if you acted boldly enough. Germany was watching all of this. Since 1919, the Treaty of Versailles had crushed Germany. It faced impossible war debts, lost territory, a tiny army, and national humiliation. But the Depression hit Germany even harder. Businesses collapsed, factories shut down, unemployment soared to 6 million. People burned money for heat because it was cheaper than coal. Germans were desperate and angry. They believed their government had betrayed them. Into this storm stepped Adolf Hitler, a failed artist, a wounded veteran, a man with an explosive voice who knew how to turn anger into energy. Hitler promised a new Germany, strong, proud, unstoppable. He blamed Jews, communists, the Versailles Treaty, and every foreign power for Germany's collapse. He knew that desperate people always look for someone to blame. In 1932, Hitler's party became the largest in the German parliament, but he still lacked full control. That came on January 30th, 1933, when Germany's aging president, Paul von Hindenburg, reluctantly appointed Hitler as chancellor, thinking he could control him. No one realized they had just handed the future of Europe to a dictator. Just 4 weeks later, the German parliament building, the Reichstag, burst into flames. A Dutch communist was arrested, but the truth of who started the fire still remains debated. What matters is how Hitler used it. He declared a national emergency. He suspended civil liberties. He arrested political opponents. He silenced newspapers that criticized him. He blamed the entire fire on the communists and demanded full power to protect the nation. The German people, frightened and confused, agreed. On March 23, 1933, the Enabling Act passed. It allowed Hitler to make laws without parliament. Overnight, Germany became a dictatorship. Posters everywhere called Hitler the savior of Germany. Soldiers swore loyalty not to the country, but to him alone. While the world stared at Germany in shock, Italy marched deeper into dictatorship. Benito Mussolini Mussolini had been ruling Italy since the 1920s, but by the early 1930s he tightened his control further. He crushed political opponents, expanded his propaganda machine, and dreamed of rebuilding a Roman Empire across Africa and the Mediterranean. Italy felt emboldened because the world had done nothing when Japan invaded Manchuria. Mussolini took the silence as permission. All across Eastern Europe, political extremism spread like wildfire. Dictators rose in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, and the Balkans. Democracy was shrinking. Authoritarianism was growing. Meanwhile, Britain and France still hoped peace could be preserved through negotiation, treaties, and conferences. They believed talking was safer than acting, but this belief would cost millions of lives. Hitler, realizing the world was afraid of confrontation, began moving faster. Germany rearmed in total secret. Aircraft factories disguised as civilian companies produced warplanes. Hidden training camps prepared pilots. Factories worked day and night producing ammunition, tanks, and weapons. Germany began building a modern war machine while pretending to follow the peace treaty. When the League of Nations questioned Germany, Hitler threatened to leave. They backed down. By 1933, Germany built its first concentration camp at Dachau. Prisoners included communists, socialists, trade unionists, and anyone who opposed the regime. The world noticed but did nothing. In Japan, extremists gained even more power. In May 1932, the prime minister was assassinated by naval officers. In 1933 and 1934, more political murders followed. The military now effectively controlled the government. The nation marched toward expansion at all costs. Across the world, violence became normalized. In France, political riots killed 15 and injured hundreds. In Austria, civil war erupted. In Spain, the stage was set for a massive conflict. In Yugoslavia, King Alexander was assassinated during a state visit. Nations were becoming unstable. And then came 1934, the year when the world stepped far closer to war. Inside Germany, Hitler feared that some leaders of his own Nazi party had become too powerful. Many of them wanted a second revolution, a more radical, violent transformation of the country. Hitler saw them as a threat. So, on June 30th, 1934, he ordered the Night of the Long Knives. Over 3 days, Hitler's secret police hunted down and murdered political rivals, military officers, and even old friends. Hundreds were killed without trial. The German army watched closely. Hitler sent them a message. He was the only power in Germany. From that moment forward, the military swore personal loyalty to him. Germany was fully under his command. 2 months later, in August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Instead of appointing a new president, Hitler merged the office with his own. He declared himself Führer, supreme leader of Germany. There were no elections, no debate, no opposition. The transition from democracy to total dictatorship was complete. Japan in the same period expanded its control deeper into China. Political assassinations continued. The belief that Japan must conquer Asia to survive became national ideology. Italy prepared for war in Africa. Mussolini promised glory. He promised conquest. He promised empire. Britain and France, exhausted and afraid of another war, continued to avoid confrontation. They cut military budgets. They focused on economic recovery. They believed Hitler could be reasoned with, that Japan might eventually stop, that Italy was not a real threat. They were wrong. By the end of 1934, the world had already taken the step that made World War II inevitable. The dictators had risen. The democracies had stepped back. Aggression had gone unpunished. Treaties meant nothing. The League of Nations had failed. The road to war wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow march. For years of ignored warnings, for years of growing armies, for years of political murder, silent invasions, and expanding empires. From 1931 to 1934, the world didn't avoid war. It built it, and when the storm finally arrived, it came from the same forces that grew during these years: fear, ambition, silence, and the belief that no one would stop you if you moved fast enough. If the world had acted earlier, if nations had been brave enough to confront aggression when it was small, the Second World War might never have happened. But history rarely gives second chances, and the lessons of these years remind us that peace isn't simply the absence of war. Peace must be defended, protected, and acted upon, because when the world looks away, the road to war becomes wide open. If you learned something new today, or want more powerful stories from history, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. And tell me in the comments which moment from 1931 to 1934 shocked you the most. Your support keeps these stories alive.